In the spring of 2022, I found myself in need of a place to stay after a sudden fallout with my roommate. A friend of a friend mentioned a small cottage available for rent just outside the city, a modest, two-story structure surrounded by dense woods. The owner, whom I'll call Mr. Adams, was eager to lease it out short-term while he dealt with a family emergency across the country. Seemed perfect for me, cheap, isolated, and available immediately. The cottage was cozy but peculiar. The lower floor had a small living room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. Upstairs, accessible by a narrow staircase hidden beneath a wooden hatch, was a single bedroom. The hatch didn't have a lock, but it felt secure enough for my needs. It was a charming little place, even if the isolation made it eerily quiet at night. The first few days passed uneventfully. I spent most of my time unpacking, working remotely, and getting accustomed to the area. My only neighbors were 2 houses down, but I rarely saw anyone. At night, I'd retreat to the upstairs bedroom, shut the hatch, and let the soft glow of the TV lull me to sleep. One night, after a particularly long day, I fell asleep early. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a sound, a faint creak from below. My first thought was that it was just the old wood settling, but the noise came again, louder this time, like the deliberate pressure of a footstep. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to listen. Then I heard it. A man's voice, low and gravelly, calling from below. "Hello? Who's up there?" Every hair on my body stood on end. I froze, barely breathing, and stared at the hatch door. The voice was unmistakable. Someone was in the cottage. Grabbing my phone, I switched off the TV and tiptoed to the small circular window above the bed. The woods outside were pitch black, the faint glow of the porch light barely illuminating the yard. I whispered, "Who's there?" into the darkness, my voice trembling. There was no reply, only silence. Gathering my courage, I opened the hatch just enough to peer down the staircase. The dim light from the living room cast long shadows across the floor, but I couldn't see anyone. Maybe I'm imagining things, I thought, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I descended the stairs cautiously, flipping on every light as I went. The living room was empty. The front door was locked, and the windows were all shut tight. I even stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin, but there was no sign of anyone. Feeling foolish, I returned upstairs, shut the hatch firmly, and tried to convince myself it was just the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. I turned the TV back on, hoping the noise would calm my nerves. Barely 10 minutes passed before I heard it again. A loud, deliberate banging on the hatch door. The sound was so sudden and violent that I nearly screamed. This wasn't my imagination. Someone or something was trying to get in. I grabbed a heavy lamp from the nightstand and stood frozen at the top of the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. The banging stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to open the hatch just a crack. The staircase was empty. Desperate, I searched for my phone to call for help, but it wasn't on the nightstand where I always left it. A sickening realization hit me, it was downstairs. I would have to go back down to get it. Summoning every ounce of courage, I climbed down the stairs as quietly as possible. The cottage was deathly silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves outside. I found my phone on the kitchen counter where I'd left it earlier, but as I grabbed it, I heard a faint scraping sound coming from the living room. I turned slowly, my stomach knotting with dread. The back door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. My instinct was to run, but something caught my eye. A faint shadow moving across the yard, disappearing into the trees. I bolted back upstairs, slammed the hatch shut, and locked myself in the bedroom. Dialing 911, I explained the situation in a shaky whisper. The operator assured me that officers were on their way. Minutes felt like hours as I sat there, clutching the phone. Then, I heard faint footsteps outside the bedroom door. My blood turned to ice. Whoever had been downstairs was now upstairs with me. I held my breath as the footsteps stopped just outside the door. Slowly, the handle began to turn. Before I could react, the door swung open. Standing there was a man, his face partially obscured by a hood. He stared at me for a moment, then smiled. A slow, unsettling grin that sent waves of terror through me. Before I could scream, he turned and walked back down the stairs. I waited until I heard the faint sound of a police siren in the distance before venturing out. By the time the officers arrived, the man was long gone. They searched the cottage and the surrounding woods but found no sign of him. The back door had been pried open, likely with a crowbar. When I called Mr. Adams to explain what had happened, he seemed oddly calm. "That's strange," he said after a long pause. "I had something similar happen a few months ago before I left. Maybe it's just someone messing with the place." The way he said it made my skin crawl, as if he knew more than he was letting on. I moved out the next day, refusing to spend another night there. To this day, I don't know who that man was or how he got into the house. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that voice in my dreams, calling softly from below. "Hello? Who's up there?" It was a Friday night in the summer of 2017, and I was on my way home after a long day at work. My car had broken down earlier that week, so I was stuck walking the 3 miles back to my small rental house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the most pleasant commute, mostly dirt roads surrounded by dense woods, but it was peaceful enough. The air was cool, and the moonlight filtered faintly through the trees. The first mile of the walk was uneventful. The dirt road was silent except for the crunch of my footsteps. But as I neared a fork in the road, I noticed something strange. Far behind me, a pair of headlights appeared, faint and distant, moving slowly. At first, I was relieved, thinking it might be a kind passerby willing to give me a lift. But as I turned to glance back, I realized the vehicle wasn't driving normally. The lights flickered off. It was unusual, but I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe they'd stopped or turned down a different road. Still, the feeling of being watched settled over me like a heavy blanket. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. About 5 minutes later, the headlights reappeared, brighter now and closer. This time, the vehicle, an old, rusted van, was moving at a crawl. No engine noise reached my ears. The van seemed to glide silently down the road. My heart started to pound as the headlights clicked off again, plunging the road back into darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was in that van was watching me. I tried to keep calm, telling myself it could be someone lost, maybe looking for an address. Still, I veered off the dirt road and into the woods, hoping to cut through to the back path that led to my house. The trees were thick here, their branches casting shadows that danced in the faint moonlight. I moved quickly, my footsteps muffled by the soft forest floor. A minute later, I heard the van's engine roar to life, the sound echoing through the trees. It was no longer crawling. It was speeding. My stomach dropped as I realized it was heading in the same direction I'd been walking. I ducked behind a large tree, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and watched as the van screeched to a stop near the edge of the woods. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. Even in the dim light, I could make out his tall, wiry frame and the baseball cap pulled low over his face. He stood there for a moment, scanning the woods like he was looking for something or someone. Then he spoke, his voice low and gruff. "Come on out. I know you're there." Panic gripped me. I stayed perfectly still, pressing myself against the tree, praying he wouldn't see me. Moments later, the passenger door opened, and another figure emerged. This one was shorter, a woman with long hair, her face obscured in shadow. She was holding something, a flashlight, maybe? She shined it into the woods, the beam sweeping dangerously close to where I was hiding. "I saw her go this way," the woman said. Her voice was calm, almost casual, but it sent chills down my spine. I realized then that they weren't just looking, they were hunting. I waited until their flashlight beams moved further into the woods, then slowly began creeping in the opposite direction. Every step felt impossibly loud, the rustling of leaves and snapping of twigs betraying my position. The further I moved, the darker it became, and the trees seemed to close in around me. Then I heard it, a faint, high-pitched giggle. It was coming from somewhere ahead of me. I froze, my blood running cold. Another voice, soft, almost childlike, called out, "You can't hide forever." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. There were more of them. I wasn't dealing with just two people. There was an entire group, and they were spread out in the woods, closing in on me. Desperate, I dropped to the ground and crawled behind a fallen log, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold onto my phone. I tried dialing 911, but the call wouldn't go through, no service. My breathing grew ragged as I heard footsteps crunching closer. I couldn't tell how many there were, but they were too close. One of the voices called out again, this time directly behind me. "We'll make it quick. Just come out." I pressed my hand over my mouth, stifling a sob. The footsteps paused, then moved away, fading into the distance. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. Eventually, I heard the faint roar of the van's engine as it sped away down the road. I waited until the forest was silent again before climbing out from behind the log. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled toward the back path that led to my house. When I finally reached it, I was too scared to go inside. Instead, I hid in the bushes near my porch, keeping my eyes on the road. A few minutes later, the van reappeared, moving slowly without its headlights. It stopped in front of my house. My heart thundered in my chest as the driver got out and walked up the driveway, his face still obscured by the baseball cap. I don't know what possessed me, but I grabbed a rock from the ground and threw it as hard as I could, hitting the side of the van with a loud clang. The man froze, turning sharply toward the sound. For a moment, I thought he'd seen me, but then he hurried back to the van and drove off. When I finally felt safe enough to go inside, I locked every door and window and stayed up all night, clutching a kitchen knife. The next day, I reported the incident to the police. They took my statement and promised to look into it, but as far as I know, they never found the van or the people in it. To this day, I don't walk anywhere alone, especially at night. And whenever I hear the faint rumble of an engine in the distance, I can't help but look over my shoulder, expecting to see that van creeping up behind me. My wife, Emma, and I live a simple life in a quiet suburb. Nothing out of the ordinary: work, dinners together, and the occasional evening of binge-watching TV shows. The kind of life most people would consider boring, but for us it was peaceful. At least it was until that night. Started like any other weekday evening. We had just finished dinner and decided to call it an early night since we both had busy mornings ahead. By 10 p.m., we were already in bed, Emma reading a book while I scrolled through my phone. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional turning of a page. At 10:15, the phone rang. The sound was jarring in the stillness of the house. Emma glanced at me, her expression uneasy. "Who calls this late?" she murmured. I shrugged and reached for the old landline on my nightstand. The caller ID displayed, "Unknown number." Normally, I'd ignore it, but something about it nagged at me, a sense that maybe it was important. I picked up. "Hello," I said. There was silence on the other end, just a faint crackling like static. Then, a deep, raspy voice whispered, "I'm watching." A chill ran down my spine. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. The line went dead. Emma noticed my expression and sat up. "Who was it?" I shook my head. "Probably a prank," I said, though my gut told me otherwise. We tried to dismiss it, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Emma suggested turning off the phone, but I left it on, thinking it was a one-time thing. I wish I hadn't. At 10:45, the phone rang again. This time, Emma grabbed it before I could. "Hello?" she said, her tone sharp. I watched her face as she listened. Her expression shifted from annoyance to fear. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Then she froze, her eyes wide with terror. She hung up abruptly and turned to me. He knew my name. "What?" I asked, the knot in my stomach tightening. She nodded, her face pale. He said, "Emma, you shouldn't have answered." And then he laughed. I felt a surge of anger. Someone was messing with us, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I picked up the phone and dialed *69, hoping to trace the call, but the automated response said the number was blocked. Frustrated, I decided to unplug the phone entirely. We tried to go to sleep, but the tension was palpable. Emma was curled up tightly under the covers, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house making my heart race. At 11:30, the doorbell rang. We both sat up, startled. Emma grabbed my arm. "Don't go down there," she whispered. I hesitated, then got out of bed and grabbed the baseball bat I kept in the closet. "Stay here," I told her. The walk down the stairs felt endless. The house was dark except for the faint glow from the porch light streaming through the windows. When I reached the front door, I peered through the peephole. My blood ran cold. A man stood at the edge of the porch, his face obscured by a dark hoodie. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his head tilted slightly as if listening for something. I gripped the bat tighter and called out, "Who's there?" No response. I glanced toward the corner of the living room where Emma kept her cell phone on the charger. I needed to call the police, but I'd have to leave the door unattended to grab it. Before I could decide, the man took a step closer to the door. "Leave now or I'm calling the cops," I shouted, my voice shaking. He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows, disappearing from view. I waited a moment, then quickly locked the door and ran to grab Emma's phone. When I came back to the door, the man was gone. The police arrived 20 minutes later, but by then, the street was quiet. They did a quick sweep of the area but found nothing. One officer stayed to take our statement while the other drove around the neighborhood. I told them about the phone calls, the man at the door, everything. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but it didn't do much to ease our nerves. After they left, we tried to settle back into bed, but neither of us could sleep. Emma kept glancing at the window, and I couldn't stop replaying the events in my head. Who was that man? What did he want? 3 a.m., the phone rang again. This time, the sound was so sudden and loud in the silent house that both of us jumped. I stared at the unplugged landline on the nightstand, the cord still coiled loosely on the floor. It was ringing. My heart pounded as I reached for it, my hand trembling. Emma grabbed my arm. "Don't," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but I couldn't ignore it. I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear. "Hello," I whispered. The same raspy voice replied, "You shouldn't have called the police." I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking. Emma looked at me, her face pale. "What did they say?" I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed the car keys and told her, "We're leaving." We spent the rest of the night at a motel across town. The next day, we called a locksmith to install new locks and security cameras. Over the next few weeks, the calls stopped, and life slowly returned to normal, though Emma and I were both more cautious than ever. But sometimes, late at night, I can't help but stare at the unplugged landline on my nightstand, wondering if it will ring again.